And you can imagine that there's got to be some political pressure on Putin from the oligarchs there that are saying, "What the hell is going on? How are you going to? You can't let the Ukrainians sit there occupying land that may be valuable later. By the way, during negotiations, so only only the Ukrainians know how long that they intend to stay there. I'm hoping that there is some pressure, communication like that. It seems like this has finally reached that sort of level of hand wringing for some of the oligarchs that realize.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And we are catching up with senior retired American General, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He's commanded in Iraq and Afghanistan and was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. And he's a regular and highly appreciated commentator on Frontline. It's Thursday, the 12th of September at 4 o'clock UK time. General Hodges, welcome back to Frontline. Great to see you again. Now, you are one of 17 signatories of an open letter to the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, coinciding with their visit to Kyiv to meet President Zelensky, in which you are urging for the lifting of restrictions on using Western-donated weapons to strike deep into Russia. How hopeful are you?
Well, I'm hopeful in that every red line we have put in front of ourselves we've eventually stepped over it, after enormous pressure from the public sector, as well as people, old people like me that have an interest in seeing us do the right thing. So there was so much rumor out in the last 2 days. I have some optimism that they're eventually going to get there. It's just maddening that it takes so long to do what seems so obvious.
And it's difficult to say what might happen between the timing of this conversation and when it's actually published, because things are moving all the time. But the indications at this particular moment are that no decision has actually been taken yet. But President Biden has conceded the US is working out what permissions it may or may not give for long-range missile strikes. Why did you feel you had to write the letter now? Do you think it might make the difference?
Well, first of all, I love it that both the British Foreign Secretary and the U.S. Secretary of State are doing this together. That's powerful. I also think that not only is your Foreign Secretary an extremely capable diplomat, Secretary Blinken is probably one of the more forward-leaning members of this administration, much more so than the Defense Secretary, frankly. And so that gives me some optimism that they are pushing to do what they can. And also then to come back and convey to the president why this is the right step to take. But because you never know, we felt that it was important to emphasize the importance of it. So I generally say yes to most of these kinds of opportunities because I do want to add my voice because I think it is so important.
That voice must be getting hoarse because it's something you've been wanting for some time now, isn't it, Ben? If Ukraine is granted permission to use Storm Shadow and similar systems in Russia, what would they target that hasn't been targeted already? I mean, you suggest, for example, that facilities that may be housing Iranian-provided ballistic missiles could be targeted.
Well, why would we not go after that? I mean, why would we sit and wait for Iranian missiles to be launched by Russians against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, killing people, and then we wring our hands, talk about thoughts and prayers? Why do we wait and see what they do with them? The Israelis never seem to have a problem interdicting Iranian nefarious activity. Why are we unable to do something somehow that makes it difficult for Russia to receive things like ballistic missiles from Iran? Now, to the point of your question, though, I heard the SACEUR General Cavoli say one time that you can defeat mass, which is Russia's only real advantage. You can defeat mass, their numbers, with precision if you have enough time. And of course, what he's talking about is going after headquarters, going after logistics, going after artillery, going after airfields. If you take away those things, then it doesn't matter how many thousands of untrained, unlucky Russian troops are milling around out there.
Escalation fear has always stood in the way of relaxing those restrictions. Does the intelligence of those Iranian short-range ballistic missiles being sent to Russia, which incidentally the Kremlin and Iran deny, of course they would, I suppose, but does that make those arguments irrelevant now?
Well, I just think that we have been living in excessive fear that Russia might escalate. They might use a nuclear weapon somehow, and I think there is. Yes, you have to be conscious of it. Yes, you have to respect the fact that they have thousands of nuclear warheads, of which probably about 1,500 of them are ready, could be used on fairly short notice. And clearly, they don't care about how many innocent people they kill, including their own, but there's no benefit for them to use a nuclear weapon anywhere. And my president has told them they would suffer catastrophic consequences. The Indians and the Chinese have said, do not use nuclear weapon, not for moral reasons, but they don't want a disruption to their access to cheap Russian oil and gas. So it just doesn't seem at all likely that they would ever do it. The real benefit for the Russians comes from us, but they see we deter ourselves out of this fear. And this is not a war of this is not an existential war for Russia. If it was existential, I mean, they've always said the survival of the motherland. Of course, they would use a nuclear weapon. This was a war of choice that they'd made to invade Ukraine. So none of this makes any sense that they would actually. And I don't mean that in an American or British logic. I mean from a Russian perspective. What possible benefit would they get from using a nuclear weapon? None.
Who or what do you think is holding up this decision?
Well, that starts at the top. My president has just a week ago, he said nothing about our policy has changed when he was asked specifically about this. Now, he is surrounded by a lot of hardworking, super educated, intelligent Russia experts who I think, frankly, have been wrong for years about this. They were wrong during the Obama administration, and they continue to be wrong. And there is a community of people that have an unbelievable amount of access and influence in Washington D.C. that also, press for, come on, we got to force Ukraine to stop fighting, let Russia have Crimea, and this is the most naive, pro-Kremlin approach I can imagine. Of course, London and Berlin and other places are not immune to this kind of infection either. But this is really where it is. I don't think we can just blame it on Jake Sullivan, for example.
Let's just talk to a little bit about events on the ground itself. And Western analysts, including President Zelensky now speaking, are detecting that a Russian counteroffensive is underway in Kursk to retake land seized by Ukraine. Russia is claiming to have retaken several villages. Do we know what forces are being used and how big this is?
So we're about 6 weeks into this now since Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in the Kursk direction. Um, it has taken quite some time for Russia to mount a credible, strong response to it. I've seen numbers that range between 30 and 40,000 Russian troops that would be involved in this. Perhaps that's accurate. I don't know. They've been attempting over the last few weeks to gather people from different parts of the Russian Federation to do it. So we should not think of this as like a NATO corps that's counterattacking. These are troops that are being gathered together from different places. So I don't know how coherent their response is, but nonetheless, it's going to be something that the Ukrainians will have anticipated, and I suspect that they have prepared defenses. They have got capabilities to deal with it. But at some point, they may get overwhelmed. I just don't know the numbers that are out there and the quality of the Russian force. But none of these things happens in a vacuum. The Ukrainians have been very effective at disrupting Russian rail lines for the whole region there, and I think that they will stay inside this bridgehead for until they accomplish the purpose for which they created it to begin with.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's very difficult to know exactly what the reality is on the ground. The Institute for the Study of War has been writing that there may be an attempt underway to cut through the Ukrainian salient along its western edge. It's largely an area of fields and small settlements before mounting a more organised and well-equipped push towards the international border. Whatever the reality is, how important is it that Ukraine can hold on to the ground it's taken in Kursk?
Well, this is what the soldiers, their grandfathers, would have done in the Second World War. Whenever in the fighting on the Eastern Front, you had these huge offensives and counteroffensives, and there would be breakthroughs, and units would be bypassed, and then they would counterattack. There's a lot of mobile warfare in this open areas, and so that what you just described sounds like the kind of thing that a well-trained, proper Russian general staff would be directing. I don't know that they've got the capability to do that. We'll find out soon enough. But you have to go back to the original purpose for which Ukraine launched this counteroffensive in the Kursk direction. It was to create a buffer. It was to change the narrative of the war to show that Russian victory was not inevitable. It was to draw off, hopefully, some of the Russian forces that were committed in the eastern part of Ukraine and Donbass in the Pokrovsk direction. But it also, I believe, is intended to create a dilemma for the Kremlin. Do they deal with this, or do they continue fighting in Pokrovsk, or do they have to? What do they do about it? And you can imagine that there's got to be some political pressure on Putin from the oligarchs there that are saying, "What the hell is going on? How are you going to? You can't let the Ukrainians sit there occupying land that may be valuable later, by the way, during negotiations." So only the Ukrainians know how long that they intend to stay there.
Yeah, that point that you just made, it leads me on to my next question, which was before this actual moment, the head of MI6, the UK's Secret Intelligence Service, met with the director of the CIA in London, and they spoke, among many things, about the Kursk operation. And Bill Burns of the CIA, he said that it had triggered these questions about the point of the war among Russia's elite. How powerful are those voices, and how useful is it to the West and to Ukraine to provoke them into speaking?
So I have always hoped since this thing started that we were finding ways to reach the oligarchs, the people around Putin that keep him in power, to tell them, say, look, you are never, ever, ever going to be able to get back to your flat in London or get on your yacht in the Adriatic. You're never going to get any of this back until this war is over. So put the pressure on them, make it hurt financially as well as personally, hold them accountable for what Putin is doing. So I'm hoping that there is some pressure, communication like that. It seems like this has finally reached that sort of level of hand wringing for some of the oligarchs that realize, you know, Kate, in Vietnam, we lost the war in 1968. It didn't really end until, as you know, the Paris Treaty in 72, and then South Vietnam fell in 75. But the Americans lost in 68 because for years, our different administrations have been telling the American people, we're winning, we're winning. We're killing thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. We're winning, but we got to keep sending more troops. And then the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive in 1968, stunned everybody. And after that, public support went downhill. Now, I'm not comparing this Kursk counteroffensive to the Tet Offensive, but it could have that kind of effect on people that have influence inside Russia, but outside of the Kremlin.
And yet, President Putin has an iron grip, doesn't he, on his population at the moment? No one dare speak out publicly, or they'll be thrown in jail or worse. How crucial do you think, in that light, is given the huge losses that the Russian forces are taking in the Donbass for every sort of inch of ground that they gain? How crucial is it that, say, for example, something like Pokrovsk is taken before winter to give Putin some kind of thing to prove that his campaign is gaining something?
I like what what the head of MI6 said, Mr. Moore, at that FT weekend event. when he told Director Burns, don't confuse having a strong grip with a stable grip on power. And so, yes, you're right that Putin does have an enormous interior security apparatus. I don't think we're going to see Russians in the streets the way you do in many other places. I don't think it's in their DNA actually anymore. Um, but the Putin does clearly have concerns because thus far they have avoided this general mobilization that would mean that young men from Moscow and St. Petersburg would be uh, drafted, would be brought into the military. And my sense is that for the last few years, they have avoided doing that because obviously um, it will be difficult to hide the reality of the war when you've got funerals going through the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which will surely happen if you have a bunch of soldiers that come from these cities. So there is some concern about impact on the Russian population by the direction of the war.
And is President Putin and his military leaders feeling pressure to deliver some kind of progress, some kind of result before the winter in the Donbass?
This is a classic political thing to say, I want this done by this date, whether it's from a democratic country or a dictator, because you are conscious of having to deliver something to show that it's worthwhile. And so these thousands of people are going to die because of a desire by the Kremlin to capture this destroyed town of Pokrovsk that has been mistakenly referred to as strategically important when it's not strategically important. The Ukrainians have already quit using it. They're only defending in front of it to bleed out as the Russians as much as they can.
Mm. You've spoken before about the need for a coherent US strategy towards the war in Ukraine. Antony Blinken, David Lammy in Kyiv, meeting Zelensky, the British Prime Minister due to meet President Biden, President Zelensky delivering his victory plan. It does feel like a critical time at the moment. Is that a growing will to supply Ukraine with everything it needs to win the war? Is that will growing and to win it on its own terms? Or do you think it is just to get in a good position for negotiations?
I honestly don't know. We're in a weird place right now. President Biden, we're come just a few months away from the end of his term as president of the United States. Um, if Vice President Harris becomes our president, she would most likely continue on generally the same arc, although I imagine that she would be more proactive because this will be at the front end of her time and we'll be thinking, how does she, uh, how do we with our allies organize for victory in the longer term, dealing with Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, and China? But at least it won't get worse or weaker. If it's a Trump administration, I'd be very concerned about what comes next. But I am uneasy that there is so much talk and there's so much influence by people back in Washington that have been clamoring saying that there's no way Ukraine can win. Come on, we need to get to a negotiation. And I'm like, can you look at a map? How can you say that there's no way Ukraine can win? That after 10 and a half years, Russia controls only 18% of Ukraine. They've lost 600,000 troops. The Black Sea Fleet, no longer a factor. The Russian Air Force has failed its two most important tasks. If we got serious about winning, we would have already stopped Russia from being able to export oil through the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea to China and India. No Iranian missiles would ever reach Russia. So if we were serious about those things, we'd be having a whole different conversation. So I am uneasy that there still are too many voices that say we need to get to a resolution soon. And that usually means force Ukraine or try to pressure Ukraine to give up Crimea.
You speaking to us from Germany, and the German Chancellor has called for a renewed effort to bring peace to Ukraine. He wants the next, and he says he and Zelensky agree that they want the next peace conference to involve Russia. What has to happen for that to even be on the cards?
Well, the Russians, excuse me, the this war is never going to end until Putin realizes he cannot win. And as long as he thinks that the West is prepared to abandon Ukraine or undermine Ukrainian efforts to win and will stop short of helping Ukraine restore its sovereignty, then he will keep going. So, peace talks involving Russia, okay, fine. But if the Russians show up and they have no intention of ever living up to some kind of long term, no kidding, uh, enforceable agreement, then this will be about as valuable as this ridiculous Minsk process was. And my confidence that Putin and the Russians would ever live up to any agreement is very, very low.
You're in a quite a good position to be able to see the conflict from different perspectives, given that you spend time in the US, you are an American, but you live in Germany, and you've had the role as Commander US Army Europe. What is the mood within Germany? Because right now, Olaf Scholz has intense domestic political pressure on himself. His centre-left coalition suffered significant losses in regional state elections. What are people in Germany saying about the war in Ukraine? Can Ukraine depend on Germany and rely on Germany?
I think that by and large, yes, that Germany will continue to deliver capabilities that Ukraine needs. But you are 100% correct that the current government is fragile. You know, it's a coalition government with three different parties. Um, the main opposition party, of course, the Christian Democrats are a much stronger supporter of Ukraine. The Greens, interestingly, are one of the most hawkish parties in Germany, pro-Ukraine. But the Bundeskanzler himself, Mr. Scholz, is just, I think he's really struggling personally and with the left side of his party, the SPD, on what to do here. Um, I mean, he's having to overcome decades of I don't want to say pacifism, but an unwillingness to hold Russia accountable in a meaningful way. And then, of course, the recent elections in Saxon and Thuringia, uh, where you had AFD and also this Sarah Wagenknecht party, both of which are anti-Ukraine, pro-Russian, in the war now, and that's on the rise, directly in response to immigration issues. And of course, that's not a coincidence. Most of what Russia does is intended to force to weaponize migrants, whether they come from Syria or from Ukraine or other parts of the world. So it's a long rambling answer. I apologize, but
It's good.
um, I do think that the Germans will continue. There's still across most of the population a recognition that Ukraine needs to be supported, and they also know that if Ukraine fails, there'll be another 5 or 6 million Ukrainian refugees that will be headed to Germany.
The 24th Ukraine Contact Group meeting in Ramstein recently concluded. Coalition of more than 50 countries to coordinate support for Ukraine. It flagged up the need to invest in Ukraine's defence industrial base to help ramp up its own production as well as provide equipment more quickly to it. How much progress do you think there has been with this group, and what are the challenges?
Well, it's been an important structure for building consensus, for actually delivering capabilities. It's amazing. I'm sure the Kremlin never imagined that there would be 50 countries still at this point united in delivering different types of capabilities to the Ukrainian side. Um, so that's important in and of itself. But by itself, that's not going to win the war. I think the move towards helping Ukraine redevelop its own defense industry is an important step. And so, as more and more countries feel confident about allowing their companies to set up shop inside Ukraine, whether it's for maintenance or production or various other functions, I think this is a positive thing. You know, some people my age will remember that Ukraine was the heart of the defense industry of the Soviet Union. So there is a kind of a residual engineering expertise, IT expertise that's there. How do they know how to make stuff? And so I feel pretty optimistic that despite what Russia is doing, that Ukraine will continue to grow its capability. I live here in Frankfurt, and the memories of the Allies bombing the hell out of this city during the war are everywhere. But German aircraft production actually increased through the year 1944. It was higher at the end of 44 than it was at the beginning of 44, despite the zillions of bombs that were dropped by the U.S. Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force.
Another one of the conclusions from this meeting was the need to help Ukraine reconstitute its combat forces, create new ones between now and next spring to help build a combat-ready future force. Is that perhaps the biggest challenge?
It is a challenge because they have to do this while they're at war and while they need as many soldiers as they can get. Yet, to do this into the future, to make sure that they have capable forces in 2025 and 26 and 27, they have got to improve what we would call the institutional army. And that's the part of the army that recruits, trains, and educates to produce the fighting force. And that's manpower intensive, it's resource intensive, and you want to have quality officers and sergeants that have experience. That's who needs to be doing the training. Now, the government also has the responsibility to convince Ukrainian families that they are not going to take a young man or young woman and throw them into the meat grinder. Instead, they are going to get that young man and woman, turn them into a soldier. They'll be properly trained, they'll be properly equipped, and they'll be put into a proper unit before they're sent off. But I think there still are some vestiges in Ukrainian society of the old Soviet way. I spoke to a Ukrainian friend a few weeks ago who was a very senior member of the Ukrainian parliament, and now she is a sergeant in the Ukrainian military. And she said that people still think of the army as a prison army in the old Soviet model, and so the government has to change that perception about what will happen to their son or daughter should they join.
And that's going to take time, isn't it? It can't
Yeah,
be
of
done
course.
overnight.
Absolutely.
Uh, just to draw on your time, that recent weeks that you spent in the US, you had chance to go around, talk to people. Presumably, Ukraine will have been on the tip of your tongue. I mean, what did people generally? What feel did you get from the US about the attitude towards Ukraine?
Either pro-Ukrainian. I mean, I was in Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. So you still see a lot of Ukrainian flags. Um, but there also was a degree of apathy, and people would say, "Yeah, it's terrible what the Russians are doing, but what about us? I mean, why are we spending all this money?" So if you had the chance to take a few minutes and explain to a group, as I did in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, for example, um, explain why this matters to America. That the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It affects so many things in terms of our economic prosperity. It deters China, et cetera, et cetera. And why it was important that we support them. Almost universally, people would go like, "Oh, I didn't know that." And so yeah, they need to listen to Times Radio because I know you do a good job of explaining.
Ben, thank you so much. Flattery will get you everywhere.
This is where my president has not done a good job. The president and civilian leaders have got to explain to the American people, just like your prime minister has got to explain to the British people, why this matters, why we're doing it.
It's really interesting, though, that your success rate of actually changing people's minds, though. Did you say pretty much everybody you could change their mind?
I would like to say everybody, but the vast majority. I didn't have anybody. I can't remember somebody going like, "You're full of crap," at least not on that topic.
Mm. Just to end, the anniversary of 9/11, the terrorist attacks have just been commemorated in New York. As an American, to what extent does this serve as a reminder of the thin line between national and global security?
Well, I was watching some of the commemorations yesterday, and the most gut wrenching ones are the ones where they read out these last phone calls from a woman who was in one of the towers calling her husband, explaining that there's no way she's getting out, or the guy that was on the airplane, the one that crashed into I think it was the one that crashed into the Pentagon, that explained, was able to somehow call his wife. And I mean, those are gut wrenching. These are totally innocent people going about their life. So I think even all these years later, that still is is poignant. But I also, when I think about it, two things come to mind. First of all, how Americans came together uh, in the aftermath. I mean, there was a unity uh, between Republicans and Democrats, between all parts of the country. It's like, God dang it, we have been attacked. And it showed that Americans can overcome these huge divisions that we have in our country right now, that they can be overcome when people realize there's something so much bigger at stake. But it also, this was the only time in the history of NATO, which we just commemorated 75 years of NATO, after 9/11, when Lord Robertson was the Secretary General of NATO. It's the only time that NATO invoked Article 5. An armed attack on one shall be considered. Whew, I'm getting an armed attack on one shall be considered an armed attack on all. It only happened after 9/11, which, I think I never pass up a chance to remind Americans when they have a complaint about NATO or why don't allies do more. And I think it's important to remind them that not only did Americans come together, but allies came together.
And let's hope that is the only time that Article 5 will have to be invoked. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, thank you so much for spending time with us again. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for the privilege, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.